The sun hung low over the prairie like a heavy gold coin melting into the dust. Heat shimmered above the wagon wheels as townsfolk gathered by the wooden auction block, the air thick with flies and dry laughter. In a town like Wilford Ridge, entertainment came cheap, and cruelty even cheaper. Boots scuffed gravel. Someone spat. A boy snickered as his father elbowed him toward the stage. She stood there. Delilah May was not a woman you overlooked, though the townsfolk had tried for years. Tall, broad-hipped, with arms like she could carry the weight of 10 winters and still have strength left to stir stew. Her hair was pinned back in stubborn braids, and her face, though soft and kind, was unreadable, like a ledger with the ink scrubbed out. She wore her mother's Sunday dress, faded lilac once, now the color of old bruises. They'd put her on the block like she was livestock, claimed it was for debt. Her brother stood off to the side, jaw set in drink-bitten defiance, arms crossed like he was doing the town a favor. He didn't look at her. Hadn't for years. The auctioneer, a man named Triggs with lips too wet and eyes too narrow, slapped a hand against the post and cleared his throat. Next item: strong, domestic, and hard-working. Knows her way round a hearth and a hoe. What'll you start me at? Laughter cracked through the square like dry timber. A man in a dusty apron yelled, "Only if she comes with her own dinner rations." Another added, "That one'll cost extra feed just to move across the porch." Delilah didn't flinch. Her hands were clasped in front of her belly, fingers tucked one into the other. Not clenched. Not begging. Still. As if her body had learned long ago that reacting only gave them something to take. She scanned the crowd once. Faces she'd known her whole life. Mrs. Penner from the bakery, chewing her lip like it were dough. Sheriff Harlan, eyes down, suddenly interested in the buckle on his belt. Then, Luke Wallace. His hair was still curled like golden wheat, but the kindness that once lived behind his smile had soured into something leaner. Once, when they were 15, he had asked her to dance beneath the fairground lanterns. Now he leaned against a post, smirking like a child watching flies drown in molasses. "She's got a heart," someone muttered behind him. "She's got a pantry," Luke replied. Delilah's breath caught, but only for a moment. Then it passed, and the weight in her chest settled again like old earth. Her worth wasn't for them to auction. Not really. But the world had never asked her what she thought. The bidding paused. The crowd murmured. Triggs wiped his brow, lips tightening. "Come now, ain't she a sturdy woman? Stronger than your oxen. Who'll take her for $5? Silence stretched. $3. Still nothing. From the back of the crowd, Boots moved, slow, steady. Not stomping, not charging. Just moving. The sound was low, rhythmical. The town parted as the man came forward, and even the flies seemed to pause. Elias Danner. The widower cowboy, they called him. Lived out past Cottonwood Ridge in a house nobody visited. Rumor said he buried his wife under a mesquite tree and hadn't spoken to a soul since. His coat was worn thin, sleeves patched with rawhide. His face was sun-marked and quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything of the world, and expects even less in return. He looked up at her. Not around her. Not above her. Not through. At her. Delilah felt it, sharp and strange. Like she'd been a window all her life, and someone had finally opened the shutters. Elias lifted a single finger. $2, he said. A chuckle ran through the crowd like wind through dry stalks. Triggs blinked. "2? Sir, that's a bargain and a half." "No one else is bidding," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice that came from somewhere deep and slow-moving, like river water that knew the shape of its bed. Triggs hesitated, then tapped the post. "Sold." To the man in the dusted coat. Gasps scattered. Someone said, "He must have lost his mind out there in the hills." Another muttered, "Just wants someone to cook, I reckon." A few even laughed. But no one stepped forward to stop him. No one ever did. Elias turned without a word and walked back through the crowd. When he reached his wagon, He waited. Didn't call to her. Didn't look back. Just stood, hands loose at his sides. Delilah looked once toward her brother. He wouldn't meet her eye. She stepped off the platform. Her boots hit the ground heavier than they had all her life, but they carried her toward the wagon like they finally belonged to something steady. She climbed up beside him. The wood creaked beneath her, but Elias didn't shift. He only handed her the reins and asked softly, "Want to drive?" She nodded, surprised her voice still worked. The wheels turned. The town behind them grew small, swallowed by dust and wind. She didn't ask why he'd bid. He didn't explain. They didn't need to. For a long time they rode in silence, but as the sun dipped behind the hills, throwing long, golden shadows across the trail, Delilah felt the first stir of something unfamiliar. Not hope. Hope was too brittle, too naive. This was quieter. Older. Like maybe, just maybe, being chosen wasn't always about being wanted. Sometimes it was about being seen. And as they disappeared into the belly of the prairie, the last sound from Wilford Ridge wasn't laughter. It was the faint creak of a porch door swinging in the wind, and the silence that follows when something shifts, just enough, to change the course of everything. The prairie lay wide and quiet under the blush of early morning, the grass swaying like 1,000 soft whispers beneath a sky brushed with gold. The wind moved gently, as if not wanting to disturb the stillness of the little homestead tucked into the rise between two hills. Elias's cabin stood there, sturdy, plain, weather-worn like him. Smoke curled from the chimney in a slow spiral. The scent of coffee and damp earth mingled with wood smoke in the air, and the first bird calls rose like timid prayers. Delilah sat on the porch steps with her skirt gathered around her knees, shelling beans into a tin bowl. Her fingers moved steady, rhythmic, as if they remembered a life before auctions and silence. She didn't look up when Elias walked past her with an armful of firewood. He didn't speak either. The only sound was the faint crack of bark and the soft fall of beans into metal. One by one. It had been 3 days since he brought her here. He hadn't told her what she was to do, where to sleep, or what she meant to him. No ceremony, no claim. Just space. Enough space to hang her dress beside the door and fold her apron into a drawer. Enough silence to let her fill it how she chose. He rose before dawn each morning. She knew by the sound of the door creaking open and the scrape of boots on dirt. He'd tend to the horses, the fence, the feed, and then return to find biscuits rising and coffee poured. She didn't ask what he expected. He didn't offer any words to measure her worth. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. Men had always looked at her with calculation or disdain. A ledger in their eyes. Too much of this, not enough of that. Elias didn't measure. He simply noticed. Like now. He paused at the top of the steps, set the firewood down gently beside the door, and leaned against the post. The sun caught in his beard, turning silver whiskers to threads of copper. His eyes, the color of creek water after snowmelt, glanced toward her bowl. Those for supper? Could be. She didn't meet his gaze, but a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Don't rush on my account," he said. "I don't rush for anyone," she answered. And that was all. No chuckle, no praise. Just a quiet exchange, like pebbles dropped into deep water. Later, she found herself wandering the small garden behind the barn. The soil was dry, but rich. Someone had cared for it once, neatly furrowed rows, the faint ghost of squash vines curling along the edges. She knelt and began to clear weeds without asking. Her hands found purpose in the dirt, the way they always had. She liked things that grew from patience, the way they didn't demand, the way they waited to be understood. From the corner of her eye, she saw Elias watching from the barn door. He didn't move to stop her. Just nodded once, slow and sure, before vanishing back inside. By evening, the table was set for 2. Nothing fancy. Just stew thick with beans and carrots, a loaf of crusty bread, and a pot of tea steeped dark and strong. He bowed his head before eating, murmured a prayer too quiet to catch, and she waited respectfully, hands folded in her lap. They ate with the silence of people who knew hunger in different ways. Halfway through the meal, he asked, "You sew?" She nodded. "Taught myself with grain sacks." He gestured to a worn pile of linen by the hearth. "Old curtains need mending. They get stiff come winter." "I can do that." "Take your time." Again, no urgency. No instructions. No gratitude, even. That night, she sat by the fire with her needle and thread, stitching slowly. The fabric was thin and stubborn, but she didn't rush. Her fingers moved with care, coaxing it back to usefulness. Elias read a worn book in his chair, boots off, one leg stretched out, the other tucked beneath him. Occasionally, he'd glance her way, not in judgment but in acknowledgment, as if she were as much a part of the room as the fire and the kettle and the creak of the floorboard. She wondered if this was what it meant to be wanted, not in the way the world used the word, with eyes and touches and possessiveness, but in the way soil wants rain. Quietly, deeply, with room enough to bloom. At bedtime, she climbed into the small room he'd cleared for her, just off the kitchen. A modest bed with a fresh quilt. Her trunk by the foot. A basin for washing. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. No locks. No shame. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened. Heard the distant hoot of an owl. The pop of wood splitting in the hearth. And then, faintly, the sound of a harmonica drifting through the wall. Just a few notes. A lullaby almost forgotten. Worn with memory, but still tender. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her. The next morning, she found a chair waiting for her outside. Not one from the porch, but a new one, carved with thick arms and a wide seat, sanded smooth. She ran her hand over the wood, fingertips tracing the grooves. He stepped out behind her, cradling a mug in his calloused hand. "Wasn't sure the others suited you," he said. Delilah stared at him, something thick rising in her throat. No one had ever made a chair for her. No one had ever noticed what didn't fit. She sat, the wood cradling her like it had been shaped just for her body. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. "I'm not sure I'm anything," Elias replied. Then added after a breath, "But you can stay if you want." She looked out across the land, where the wheat rolled like ocean waves and the sky never stopped. "For how long?" "As long as you need." And in that moment, she realized he had never called her a wife, never called her anything at all. But this place, this quiet, unassuming kindness, was beginning to call her home. She glanced at the chair again, then at the man who built it, and wondered, not for the first time, what it might mean to belong somewhere without apology. But as the wind picked up and scattered the petals of the garden's first bloom, a thought settled over her like shadow. What if kindness had a cost she hadn't yet seen coming? The storm rolled in like a low growl across the plains, swallowing the sun in a slow, greedy sweep. Clouds gathered thick as wool, pressing low over the house as if the sky itself leaned in to listen. Wind snaked through the grass, whispering warnings through the loose chinks in the cabin walls. Inside, the world folded into flickering lantern light and the scent of rain beginning to fall. Delilah sat on the braided rug beside the hearth, her skirt pooled around her, fingers busy with an old quilt she'd found tucked in the rafters. It was worn and threadbare, a patchwork of sun-faded cottons and crooked seams. She'd spent the last week mending it with scraps from Elias's old shirts and the hem of a ruined tablecloth. Her stitches weren't perfect, but they held, stubborn and true. Each square told a story, even if no one had spoken it. Elias sat across from her, one boot braced against the hearthstone, a pocket-knife in hand. He was carving a piece of driftwood into something undecided, the blade moving in slow arcs, quiet as thought. The firelight danced against his weather-lined face, softening the edges into something almost gentle. The thunder cracked, sharp and sudden. The lantern flickered. Neither of them flinched. "Storm set in deep," Elias said, without looking up. She nodded, tugging a seam tighter. "Sounds like it's got a long night in it." They fell into silence again, The kind that wasn't empty but rather full of all the things that didn't need saying. Outside, rain struck the windows in steady rhythm. Inside, the cabin felt like a place carved out of time. Delilah looked at the quilt in her lap, then up at him. Did she make this? Elias didn't ask who she was. Some of it, he murmured. She never liked the corners. Said the angles felt too strict. She liked curves. Things that rolled and wrapped. Delilah touched the edge of a patch shaped like a crescent moon. It's beautiful. It was meant to be used, not admired. Her fingers paused. Still beautiful. He didn't answer. The fire crackled, throwing sparks up like fleeting stars. Delilah set the quilt aside. Her hands folded in her lap, unsure suddenly. She could feel something shifting between them, not new, but clearer. As if all the quiet kindness, all the space and steadiness, was finally threading itself into something whole. I was engaged once, she said, voice low. Elias lifted his eyes, slow and patient. He was a cooper's son. Laughed with his whole chest. Said he didn't mind my size, that it made me look like a woman ought to. Then his father saw me. She drew in a breath. Said it was bad business. Said no barrel maker should marry a woman who'd make the casks look small. The silence stretched, long and fine. Elias set the wood down beside his boot. He was a fool. Delilah smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I thought maybe if I shrank myself, there'd be less to mock, less to shame. So I stopped eating biscuits, laced tighter, smiled smaller. I became a shadow of a woman. And still, it wasn't enough. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. You ain't meant to shrink. The words hung between them, unadorned and steady. She felt them settle somewhere beneath her ribs. She looked up. What about you? Did you love her? Elias's jaw worked slightly. My wife. She nodded. I loved her quiet ways. The way she'd hum while planting beans. The way she'd sit up nights reading books with no endings. He exhaled. But I don't think I ever told her. Not in words. Delilah studied him. Why not? He shrugged, gaze drifting to the flames. Wasn't taught to say things out loud. Just thought working hard and staying close was enough. Was it? He shook his head, slow and aching. Not when she died, thinking maybe it wasn't. Delilah drew her knees to her chest, resting her chin there. The storm battered harder now, wind howling against the roof, rattling the windows like it was trying to get in. She didn't move. Neither did he. Minutes passed. Or maybe an hour. Then Elias reached behind his chair, pulling a folded bundle wrapped in burlap. He set it beside her, hands careful. I found this when I was clearing the cellar. Thought maybe you'd want it. She unwrapped it slowly. Fabric. Yards of it, blue calico, soft muslin, a strip of red gingham. Some faded, some new. Her breath caught in her throat. You been stitching that quilt from scraps. Thought maybe it's time you had something all your own to begin with. Her fingers curled into the cloth. No one had ever brought her anything without strings, without conditions. Not even her own family. This wasn't just fabric. It was trust. An invitation to create. A beginning. Her voice trembled. Why are you being kind to me? Elias met her gaze. Because you're worth the space you take up. The words cracked something open inside her, not shattering, but splitting the shell of an old ache she'd worn too long. She reached for the quilt again, spread it over her knees. Her hands moved without thinking, tracing the seams like they were prayers. I'm scared, she whispered. Of what? That this piece is something borrowed. Something that won't last. He looked at her a long time. Then, softly, peace isn't something you borrow. It's something you build. A log shifted in the fire. Rain pounded harder. Somewhere behind the clouds, lightning lit up the night like a brief window into another world. Delilah drew the quilt up to her chest. She didn't speak again. Neither did he. And yet, in that silence, something changed. As if two old ghosts had decided to sit beside them and let go of what they'd carried for too long. The storm moved on just before dawn. She stepped outside, barefoot in the damp grass, the quilt around her shoulders. The sky was a clean slate now, soft blue, with streaks of peach blooming on the edges. Behind her, the door creaked open. Elias stood in the threshold, watching her. She turned and said, voice hushed, "I never knew comfort could be so quiet." He nodded once, then pointed beyond the field. "There's something I want to show you. Something buried deep." And though he didn't say what, her breath caught, because something in his voice promised a story that might just change everything. The road into town shimmered with early heat, the dust rising in pale ribbons behind the wagon wheels. Delilah sat tall beside Elias, her hair braided and pinned with care, a clean kerchief tied at her neck. She'd chosen the blue calico dress, stitched from the fabric he'd given her, because it made her feel less like a stranger in her own skin. It didn't cinch or hide. It draped. Let her be. Elias held the reins loose, his gaze forward, steady as always. A man carved from long days and quiet thoughts. The closer they drew to Wilford Ridge, the quieter she became, her hands folded tight in her lap. She hadn't been back since the auction, since the laughter, since the eyes that tore her down like scavengers. But now she was riding in beside a man who hadn't asked her to change, who hadn't asked anything of her at all except presence. And still, her stomach pulled into knots. They passed the blacksmith's forge, then the chapel with its leaning bell tower. Children chased a hoop past the bakery, sticky-faced and shrieking with joy. When the wagon creaked to a stop in front of the general store, the sound was sharp as a gunshot. Silence followed, brittle and expectant. Elias dismounted first. He didn't offer his hand, never did. He let her decide. And she did, stepping down with slow grace, boots meeting the earth like she belonged to it. Her shoulders were back. Her chin was high. But her pulse stuttered. They moved inside, the store bell chiming overhead. Mr. Ellery blinked at them from behind the counter, then gave a polite nod. His eyes dropped, uncertain, to the floor. She moved to the bolts of fabric while Elias checked the tool oil and seed bags. The room hummed with whispers just beyond earshot. She didn't need to hear the words. She'd heard them all before, every variation of too much and not enough. Outside, a voice carried louder than the rest. Familiar. Unwelcome. Well, I'll be damned. He did buy the ox. Delilah froze. Luke Wallace leaned against a water trough, boots crossed, arms folded, smile bitter as spoiled cider. His eyes roved over her like inventory. Behind him, a few young men chuckled, eager for sport. "Tell me, Danner," Luke called, "she pull the plow or just haul your firewood?" The laughter came easy this time, unkind and full of teeth. Elias stepped forward, slow and unhurried. He didn't reach for a weapon. Didn't raise his voice. "She's not yours to mock," he said calmly. "No." Luke smirked. Didn't realize fat came with feelings. Delilah stiffened. Her hands curled into fists. Elias turned, voice low but clear. "You speak like a man who's never known hunger. Or heart." Luke's smirk faltered. Elias looked back to Delilah, then offered her his arm. She hesitated. The town watched. Her lungs burned with shame she hadn't invited but couldn't ignore. Still, she took it, her hand sliding into the crook of his elbow, warm and firm. Gasps stirred like wind through dry grass. They walked down the main road, slow, deliberate. Like they weren't leaving anything behind. Like they carried something with them others couldn't understand. At the edge of town, she let out a long breath. Her voice came quiet. "You didn't have to defend me." "I didn't," he said. "I spoke for myself." She studied him. "Do you regret it?" Elias glanced toward the horizon. Not 1 second. They rode home in silence, but it was no longer the cautious quiet of before. It was full. Thick with thought and something beginning to take shape between them, something not fragile, but not yet spoken either. That evening, Delilah packed a basket of bread and salt pork and asked if they might take supper near the ridge. Elias nodded, already saddling the mare. They sat beneath the cottonwoods, watching the sky burn orange over the hills. The breeze tugged her braid loose. He didn't look away. "Back there," she said softly. "I wanted to disappear." "You didn't." "I wanted to." He nodded, thoughtful. "But you didn't." They ate slowly, the meal small but satisfying. Birds wheeled overhead, calling to the dusk. Afterward, Elias stood and walked a few paces to the old cedar near the edge of the ridge. He knelt, brushed leaves from a flat stone. Delilah followed. The grave was unmarked, save for a rough carving of initials weathered nearly smooth. ED and MD side by side. "She was here when I had nothing but a hammer and an idea," he said. "She built this place with me. She taught me patience." Delilah waited. "When she died," Elias continued, "I buried her here so I could speak to her without crossing half the county. But truth is, I stopped speaking at all." Delilah placed her hand lightly on the stone, then on the quilt in her lap. "She sounds kind." She was. He looked at her then, and the wind lifted a curl from her forehead. "You're not her," he said. "You don't have to be. I don't want her again. I want—" He stopped. Delilah's heart thudded. "You want what?" she asked. But he shook his head, lips pressed into a quiet line. "I don't know how to name it yet. Just don't go." She sat down beside the grave, knees drawn up. "I've spent my whole life being told I take up too much room. That I need to make myself smaller just to earn a place." Elias knelt beside her, elbows on his knees. "I never asked you to change," he said. "I know. You came into my house and filled it with steadiness, with color. You stitched warmth into things that had grown cold." Her throat ached. "I keep waiting," she whispered, "for the part where you change. Where you see me through their eyes. I've only ever seen you with mine." She turned toward him, light dying slowly behind the hills, painting his face in bronze and gold. And in that moment, she knew he was telling the truth. But before she could speak, before her lips could shape the trust blooming in her chest, a rider came thundering across the field, dust spraying behind like smoke. He reined in hard at the base of the ridge. "Elias, you're needed in town. There's been a fire. The feed barn, your name came up." Elias stood, eyes narrowing. "What about my name?" The rider swallowed hard. They think you said it. You and the woman." Delilah's breath caught. Her hands went cold. The past had followed them home. And it had brought fire with it. Night fell like a curtain soaked in sorrow. The stars stayed hidden, swallowed by smoke and suspicion. Elias hadn't said a word since the rider left. He hitched the mare with practiced hands, but his jaw was tight, and his silence was heavy. Delilah followed him down the hill, her dress catching on dry thistle, her breath tight in her chest. She didn't ask questions. Not yet. The answers were coming fast enough. When they reached the edge of town, the sky was orange behind the feed barn's charred skeleton. Flames had devoured the roof, and now only embers glowed in the bones of what remained. The air was thick with soot and accusation. Townsfolk gathered in a loose ring, their faces lit by firelight and something far darker. Hatred, maybe. Or fear disguised as righteousness. The sheriff, broad-shouldered and weary, stood in the middle. He turned as Elias and Delilah approached, hands resting just above his belt. "Evenin', Elias," he said, voice flat. "Didn't think we'd see you here so soon." Elias met his gaze, calm but unblinking. "You sent for me." "I didn't," the sheriff replied. "But folks started talkin' after what happened this morning. That maybe you had a reason to lash back. Because a man called my wife names?" That single word, wife, stilled the air around them. Delilah felt it strike her chest like a warm stone dropped into still water. He hadn't asked her. Hadn't claimed her in town before. But now, here, with the smoke rising behind him, he'd named her like a shield. Whispers stirred. The sheriff glanced at the crowd. "Ain't accusing you, Elias. Just asking questions. That barn didn't burn itself." A voice piped up from the crowd. Luke Wallace stepped forward, eyes sharp, smile gone. Man like him, living out in the hills, keeping to himself. Brings in a woman he bought like cattle, and suddenly fires start burning. Delilah stepped forward, her voice calm but cutting. You'd blame anyone who doesn't play your game, Luke. But you forget, Elias saved this town's harvest 3 years running with that same feed. What would he gain from watching it burn? Luke's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Another voice, softer this time, the baker's wife, holding her son's hand. My boy eats better since Delilah started sellin' eggs down our way. She's no arsonist. Then the seamstress. She fixed my wedding dress with hands steadier than any tailor I've known. If that's what guilt looks like, Lord help the innocent. And slowly others spoke. One by one. Pieces of a life that had quietly taken root. Biscuits traded, mending done, kindness offered without noise or ledger. A life Delilah had sewn together with thread and time. Elias looked around, his voice low but unwavering. If you want someone to blame, then search. I've got no fire in me for vengeance. Only hands for building. The sheriff studied him, then the woman at his side, standing firm though the world had tried to fold her in half too many times. He sighed. Unless there's proof, I won't hang suspicion on air. Someone muttered, dissatisfied, but the crowd began to loosen. Feet shifted. Conversations picked up in murmurs. The heat began to fade. The sheriff tipped his hat. Go on then. Let the night cool. They turned to leave. Halfway back to the wagon, Delilah touched Elias's arm. You said I was your wife. He paused. I did. She stared at him, searching for mockery, for habit, for anything false. But there was only truth. Simple and unadorned. When did that happen? She asked. He tilted his head, thoughtful. Somewhere between the first quilt square and the storm. A laugh caught in her throat, part joy, part disbelief. You never even asked. Didn't think I had to, he said. But if you want me to, I will. She looked at him. This quiet man who had offered her a chair that fit, a life that didn't demand smallness, a name spoken not with possession but with pride. And she realized, maybe love didn't always come with questions. Maybe sometimes it arrived as shelter, as steady hands, as silence that made room for breath. You didn't have to ask, she whispered. They rode home in darkness softened by moonlight. No fire. No shouts. Only the slow rhythm of hooves and hearts trying to remember they were safe. In the weeks that followed, the feed barn was rebuilt with the help of neighbors who no longer turned their eyes. Delilah sold quilts at the market and traded preserves with women who once looked through her. The town didn't change overnight, but something inside it shifted. Like the way riverbeds smooth over time, patient, persistent. On the porch, Elias carved a new sign for the cabin gate. Not their names. Not a warning. Just a word, welcome. Delilah hung a wind chime above the door made from spoons and glass beads. It sang when the wind passed through, low and warm, like laughter that had forgotten shame. One evening, as dusk fell soft and rose-colored, she pulled a wrapped bundle from under the bed. Blue gingham. A few curls of white lace. A small dress, no bigger than her hand. She brought it outside where Elias sat oiling the bridle. His brow furrowed at first, then smooth. I wasn't sure, she said, voice breaking. But I've felt the change. I know. He stood slowly. Came to her. Held the fabric between them like a prayer. The wind stirred the chime. A single note rang out, clear and steady. You built this life, he said. From ashes and silence. She touched her stomach, then his hand. No, we did. And just then, in the hush of evening, under a sky washed clean by all they'd endured, Delilah finally understood something she'd never known before. It had never been about being chosen. It was about choosing back. And she had. But as the first stars blinked open, and the warmth of that moment held them close, neither of them saw the rider in the distance again. His hat low, his horse flecked with foam. This time, he carried a letter. Stamped. Sealed. And it bore the mark of a family Delilah thought she'd left behind.